Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our first speaker series session of 2026. Um, so thank you for taking the time today. I know that everyone's quite busy and that these sessions are really lovely to sort of share in the sort of winter blues and just to lift our spirits. So thank you for taking the time. My name is Dr. Esmer Miller and I'll be chairing today's session. I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that we are in the fourth iteration of the speaker series. It started in 2022, and I cannot believe how quickly time has passed. So I'm very pleased that it has gone on for 4 years. It's in its fourth year, and that we have the tremendous support of you all and those who join on other occasions. So um, as you know, the series welcomes presentation, so I'm always open to suggestions for presenters. So if you have someone in mind that you'd like to recommend, or if you yourself have work in progress or work published that you'd like to share here, please do reach out and get in touch. And even if you've done before, even if you've presented before, obviously we're all fluid, we're not static. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Daniel Gyollai. Daniel, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone.
Um, Daniel's a postdoc at the Center for Subjectivity Research, University of Copenhagen, and is affiliated with the project Who Are We? Philosophy and the Social Sciences. Daniel's sub-project explores the relationship between collective memory and collective identity from a phenomenological perspective. The focus is on the embodied and active aspects of collective remembering and the role of intersubjectivity and the role that intersubjectivity plays in collective memory formation. Prior to joining CFS, he worked as a lecturer in criminology at Bournemouth University. So today's presentation is titled Criminology and Collective Memory, New Directions. So just very briefly, I would like to take the opportunity to remind everyone of the need for self-awareness in how we treat the space. The aim is to establish a safe forum for intellectual exchange, as I said earlier. So please be mindful and treat each other with respect and dignity as a starting point for inclusivity. So as I noted previously, the session is being recorded. And in the past, what I've done, the session is interactive. Um, Presenters usually ask for the questions, if you have questions, to be left for the end of the presentation itself. And in the past, what we've done is that questions have been written in the chat, and the questioner will read out their question unless there's something preventing you, and then I'll do the reading, or someone else will do the reading. So you can also raise your hand and sort of speak off the cuff, but I find that it's actually quite nice to have the question written so you're not speaking off the cuff. Um, so right, without further ado, I won't take up any more space. I will hand the floor over to our presenter, and Daniel can take it away.
Thanks, Asmarie, for the introduction and the invitation. Hello, everyone. Let me just try to share the thing. Uh, uh, okay. Can you see the slides?
I can
Yes.
see them. Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. So let me start so I can talk until 5. Is that
Oh
correct?
yes, yes, it's up to you to
Okay.
use your.
Cool. Right. Okay. So right. So when we first were kind of talking about this presentation with Asmarie, and I was thinking that I will talk about kind of embodied approaches to collective memory. This is what I was kind of working at the time. But then I thought that maybe I will expand the topic because lots been going on in memory studies, and I thought maybe you will find something that actually kind of interesting for your own research. Okay, so there will be a lot today, and mainly kind of theoretical or methodological issues. Okay, so first, I will talk about like what collective memory is, kind of like current debates, what are kind of the key topics or the key problems in current debates, and what are the limits of these approaches. And then I will briefly talk about that what collective memory is in historical criminology, or at least how I understand it. And mainly, I'm going to focus here in the Church and Colleagues book, 2022 book, and then. I'm going to start talking about the first main block, which would be the original topic, implicit collective memory, kind of like embodied approaches to collective memory and its relationship to ideology. And then the second topic will be about some psychological approaches to collective forgetting. It's fairly recent, but it's an increasing line of research. And also, what does it mean, kind of this for what are the consequences for memory activism? It's one of actually kind of a purpose that historical archaeology shares. Um, and then uh, the third topic is going to be collective future thought. It's something about how people imagine their future, so and the relationship between collective memory and collective future thought. Right. So, okay. So you can find many different definitions of collective memory in the literature, but there has been two main approaches, okay, in the social sciences. So one understands collective memory as shared memories of individuals, and the other sees it as something that manifests itself in symbols with shared significances for the group, like monuments and artifacts and so on. So the first is the memory in the head, and the second is sees collective memory in the word. Okay, so according to the former approach, it is ultimately the individual who remembers as member of a group and not the group itself. So they say that group mind, it's a myth, it doesn't exist. So the group cannot remember, just only the individual can remember. And on the latter review, they say it won't do because collective memory is something a collective achievement. Okay, it cannot be just simply reduced to individual memories, to individual minds, and they argue that collective memory is something that again is manifest itself in artifacts. Okay, so cognitive psychologists only joined this debate relatively recently. Okay. Um, and they argue that obviously you can guess. So they rather view collective memory as individual memories, okay, rather than shared symbols. But they argue that this methodological dichotomy is misguided because they say that memory in the head and memory in the word is just two aspects of one and the same phenomenon. Okay, so they propose the third approach, and they say that what we should do is we should pay attention that how these two are interconnected. So how individual memory shapes and shaped by cultural memory, memory in the word. So essentially, what they emphasize is that it's what we should do. It's like a system in psychology, a systematic analysis of the role of psychological processes play in the development and maintenance of collective memory in the forms of cultural symbols. And not just don't just think of like monuments, but also like narrative stories whatsoever. Right. So from then on, what psychologists did, so some of them followed a bottom-up approach and they looked at like how individual memories are shared and change within dyads and in small groups, such as like families, couples, families, and more recently also like larger networks and actually like big groups and in the wild. Um, and others, after identifying certain memories that were shared in the community or are shared in the community, like national memories, they try to kind of track down those um, psychological processes through which these develop. Um, um, and in the meantime, like sociologists, historians, anthropologists, literary scholars, they just carried on and they studied that how symbols, traditions, stories, and the like constructed and maintained, contested within and between communities. Okay, so there was the breakthrough never really came because there was very little collaboration and interaction between these two different kind of approaches, memory in the head and memory in the word. So the actual relationship is kind of still remain understudied and this tension between the two approaches is unresolved. So this is what kind of they are now focusing to resolve this issue. And very recently, this book by Earl and Hurst was published just this January, was focusing on that to kind of bring these two approaches together. Right. Okay. So, but the problem is that, I mean, with current approaches that they, most studies, not all studies, most studies kind of treat or view collective memory as shared memories, as specific groups. So we move beyond, they don't just only understand collective memories, national memories. So they obviously are discussing the multi-directionality of collective memory, but they're just looking at specific groups. And what is ignored is the process of identification. Okay, so they don't really address the complexity of the process of group identification. So, for example, just to give you an example, so people are simultaneously like members of multiple social groups. And when we interact with people, we kind of share certain identity categories, but no others. So first question is what determines that which identity categories is prompted and made salient during conversational interactions, and how do such cross-cutting identities influence the process? I mean, the process of collective remembering. And also, group identification can be triggered by many other factors other than belonging to a social group. Okay, the same social group. And all of which come from different kind of commitment, different attitudes, different emotions. Like think about the Venus that develop between intimate couples. Okay, and what is these different sort of identities, how they impact shared remembering or collective remembering? Can these identities, different identity categories, alternated? It's also an interesting question that's being discussed recently. Um, the second issue that collective identity is linked to representation and symbolic cultural resources of collective memory. Okay, but so group membership does not always need to be articulated explicitly to experience this kind of shared we-ness, this shared sense of belonging. That there are more basic, implicit, pre-reflective aspects of identification, both within in small and larger groups. So, and these are not narrative constructs. So we talk about some habits and emotions. Also the question how these impact um, the formation of collective memory. So the question here is like, what is the relationship between implicit processes of identification and explicit collective memory? And finally, what is the pressing question is the role of these relational motives to develop a shared sense of we-ness in collective memory formation. So what happened to individual memory when you want to identify with others? Okay, so there's again different approaches, different hypotheses that memories are kind of extended, distributed, inhibited, contaminated, or disrupted. It's not clear. Okay, so it's still this problem remains unresolved. Now, okay, so the interesting question. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss all these questions. I'm just so mentioning it so you know that these are the questions. But today I'm not going to focus on these problems. Okay. So collective memory in historical criminology and in Church and colleagues' book. Right. So Church and colleagues use and also kind of conflate two different conceptions of collective memory. So one kind of dominated this so-called first wave or first phase of memory studies, and the other marks kind of the start of the second. Okay, so first, collective memory understood as memories that are always influenced by our interests and purposes as members of social groups at the time of recollection, so in the present. It's a view that originates from Horvath's, okay, the founding father of memory studies. Okay, so according to Horvath's, all memories, and not just shared memories, are dynamically reconstructed in the present on the basis of the multiple social frameworks that reflects the norms pertaining to whichever group you are identifying at the moment. So whichever group's perspective you adopt um, among the many different groups you belong to, like family, religious groups, professions, and so on. Right? And the other view, it's already mentioned, so this collective memory that manifests itself like in artifacts, text, monuments, images, and provides an important source for the identity of the group is associated with the work of Osman and Nora, right? But these are two different things. Okay. Um, Now, so the reason why collective memory is important for historical criminology, as set out by Church and colleagues, is because it aims to challenge their own words, challenge dominant narratives, and so to revalue the collective identifications and attachments which they sustain. And as they elsewhere argue, so they provide, historical criminology would provide commentary and popular representations of criminal past and their power to mold collective memories and shape cultural identities in the present. But this is good because this is precisely what the third wave of memory studies is interested in. Okay, so with the flagship journal of memory studies with the same name. So it's a really relevant source for any one of you who are working on collective memory related topics. So what is this about? So why it's emerged? Because, okay, precisely because of this somewhat monolithic approach or understanding of collective memory as national memory by the second phase, Minora and Usman, that was kind of insufficient to address a wide range of topics surrounding collective memory. So most prominently, it's like fragmented nature and pluralistic nature. Yeah, so it paid very little attention to ways in which, for example, ethnicity or gender, ideology, globalization, technological innovation, the media complicate how people remember and why they forget. And this actually kind of gave rise to the third phase, which led to kind of a new memory boom, okay, with lots of methodological and theoretical advancements. So I'm just saying that it would be good to focus on that too, not just Hallbach's and Nora and Osman. Right. Um, um, Now, okay. So drawing on Aleida Osman, so she's the wife of Jan. So Church and colleagues argue that collective memory is necessarily a mediated memory. It's conveyed through texts, narratives, and representations or artifacts. Okay. And again, so in cultural memory studies, collective memory is indeed almost exclusively understood as shared representations of the past. Yeah, like in the objectified symbols. But then right after that, so Church and colleagues, so in kind of illustrating the point that there's more to collective memory, that these dominant narratives about the past, the dominant representations about the past, they refer to Lauder and Mulcahy study on the public perception of the British police. Okay, and now we kind of start talking about this first topic, implicit collective memory. So Lauder and Mulcahy, drawing on Bourdieu, they argue that attitudes some groups, and typically marginalized groups, immigrant communities, or groups that are harassed by the police, they have a totally different attitude uh, to the police, and it's totally in conflict with the idealized image of the British police, probably. And they also argue that these attitudes in large part forged through the routine activities of the police, and they function pre-reflectively without any conscious thinking. Okay, so they say that rather than being the result of explicit beliefs and knowledge, these attitudes are dispositional, such that they are produced and reproduced through a history of encounters with the police. Okay, so what does that mean? So think about, for example, like teenagers when they spot the uniform, they start running and the police start chasing them. Or for example, like a current example, sad example, it's like a Minneapolis people blowing their whistles. So it would be interesting to see so whether it become like a habitual defense mechanism in the community. So for example, in 20 years, what I can, imagine that they would not know, I mean, they would know how to react when immigration vans are kind of patrolling their streets without necessarily knowing what happened in the past that makes such reactions vital and so important. So surely that kind of the source of these habits are experiences that they accumulate over time, but they hardly ever become explicit um, on each occasion whenever these habits are triggered. Okay, so in fact, like explicit memories often fade away, and all that remains is the skill to react in a certain situation. And what is also really important here that habits are passed down to next generation without who internalize them without actually living through the actual event from they originate from. Okay, but the point is, so if you accept this view, you also need to accept that collective memory is not necessarily mediated and representational memory. Okay, so these cultural and emotional traits of the past, like primarily live on in the form of embodied social practices. Um, right. Okay. So let's just talk about a bit Bourdieu because in criminology there is a strong tradition of Bourdieu's research which demonstrates this intimate link between embodiment, memory, and the cultural continuity within criminal justice institutions. And this line of research is actually, as it were, it's a could be a good springboard for criminology, historical criminologists to contemporary approaches to implicit embodied conception of memory, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So, but just a reminder. So again, so for Bourdieu, habitus, or this embodied system of dispositions that underlie social practices, uh, are history turned into nature, or he elsewhere says they are a product of history that produces individual and collective practices. So later he says that the body hexes. It's like the disposition speaks directly to the motor function in the form of pattern of postures that is both individual and systematic because linked to a whole system of techniques involving the body and tools and charged with a host of social meanings and values. But again, which is really important is these social meanings are not explicit, okay? What does that mean, right? So now I'm going to talk about, that's the most boring part of the presentation, I'm sorry. So some contemporary approaches to uh, embodied cognition. So this is the key idea that cognition is not the representation of Preggy Burley objects, but it arises from a dynamic interplay between an active agent and the environment. Okay, so it's more precise what it means is the active agent's body and mind and the environment. So when you make sense of the environment, not everything becomes representational. Okay, it is conscious. You are conscious of it, because and that's why I don't like use the term unconscious in the context of embodiment, because you always have this some sort of minimal bodily self-awareness, or they also call it mindness, that you are the one who are acting, or things happening to you. Okay, for example, think about like when you're driving and you chat someone next to you. So this chat, that's representational, but you can still drive, you still know what you're doing. Or for example, like a, a it's maybe a better example if you um, coming up from the tube and the escalator is not working, or the airports, what do we call them? These moving uh, walkway. Okay, so I'm sure all of you had this at least once this experience that even when you see it's not working, so you're conscious of it that it's not working, and you have this awkward stumble because your body automatically kind of leans forward and compensates to avoid falling. But it never, when everything works fine, I mean, if the escalators work fine, it never becomes explicit, okay? Or so it only comes like conscious or explicit when something's wrong with you or something is wrong with the escalator, but it's still happening, okay? Right. So it's this sense making according to this view is like it's a behavior or conduct in relation to the environmental significance and valence which the organism or you itself enacts or brings forth. Okay, it's really important. You bring forth these meanings. Um, so meaning emerge in terms of the significance things have for the organism in the context of its viability. Okay, how it relates to memory. So obviously, so to reconstruct the required reaction in certain situation to respond to environmental challenges or respond to the situations, uh, the agent you need to remember. And this is what dispositions are for. Okay, so memory in this view is a system of dispositions that are open loops that are kind of functionally closed and simultaneously updated because every situation is different, okay? Whenever the organism, the agent, finds itself in similar situations. Okay, and something, um, it's a very similar thing happens in social interaction, very in social interactions. I mean, similar to the situation when you step on the escalator. So this kind of interbodily behavior patterns are activated, and they pre-reflectively convey meanings which are just as important, if not more so, than understanding each other than words. Okay, so an important term that you probably know in this context that this describe this state of affairs is intercorporality. So it's comes from Merleau-Ponty. So this synchronized behavior patterns and affective states that underlie and guide communicative interactions. Um, Now, the intergenerational transmission of these learning, these social meanings or norms in the form of these bodily habits requires imitative learning. Okay, so socialization is never fully become independent from the joint enactment and incorporation and sedimentation of bodily skills, styles, and also emotions. And this is our ability that Fuchs calls collective body memory. So the ensemble of behavioral and interactive dispositions characterizing the members of a social group which have developed in the course of earlier shared experiences and now prefigure similar interactions of the group. Um, Emotions and collective memory. So habits of interactions, they do not develop separately from emotions or the attitudes they underlie them, but they are kind of co-wired. And it's called by Fuchs affective interactive schemas. I mean, embodied habits incorporate many different mental states for that matter. And it's also an interesting question. And people working at how um, memory in the form of representations of how explicit memory kind of relates to, to body memory. But that's another talk. So I'm not going to talk about this today. Okay. Um, so because they are kind of intersubjectively sedimented, so emotions and attitudes become integral part of the culture. I mean, I'm talking about these emotions that underlie social interactions, and they pre-reflectively determine how people understand themselves in situation, how they approach others, and how we appraise things and situations in the environment. Okay, so to mention an example which is relevant for criminologists, so there is a Finnish study that analyzes how memories of displacement and family separation have been transferred within Indian and Finnish American communities and how such memories manifest themselves in the emotional responsive of descendants of those displaced people. And also like others, for example, look at the role of sedimentation of certain experiences and emotions in the construction of national identity, a sense of national belonging. Um, and something that might be especially interesting in the context of historical criminology is something called effect co-regulation, and especially in antagonistic encounters. So these are type of interactions in which conflicting emotions may be interlocking in the sense that they depend upon each other. So think about the abuser and abused relationship. The dominance and submission are kind of interlocking, or the oppressor and oppressed, when superiority and inferiority are interlocking. So these are not unidirectional relationships. So they are kind of rather reciprocal and also asymmetrical self-other relationships. So individuals kind of they aware of the other and they are simultaneously also aware being seen by the other. Okay, so in a sense, these interaction partners kind of see themselves through the eyes of the others, and they kind of mutually confirms these subject positions by internalizing this perspective. Okay. Uh, and the key point here that these sort of interlocking emotional and attitudinal patterns can be collectively sedimented over time in a community. And if they originate from a colonial era, for example, then we can use the term colonial experience in a literal rather than merely metaphorical sense. Um, okay, so to conclude this part, so for historical criminology, I think to understand how ideological oppression impacts our everyday lives unnoticed, I think it's necessary to pay attention, I mean, those habituated patterns of interaction through which they are enacted. Okay, and I'm gonna read this out. It's Bourdieu because I think he really nicely kind of summarizes what's happening here. So all the totalitarian institutions that seek to produce a new man, sick, through a process of deculturation and reculturation, set such store on the seemingly most insignificant details of dress, bearing, physical and verbal manners. Because treating the body as a memory, they entrust to it in an abbreviated and practical, i.e., mnemonic form, the fundamental principles of the arbitrary content of culture. The principles embodied in this way are placed beyond the grasp of consciousness and hence cannot be touched by voluntary, deliberate transformation, cannot even be made explicit. But this is what actually I think that it should be one of the tasks of historical criminology to make these implicit collective body memories explicit. Okay? Because why that's the thing that while culture is multimodal and beliefs and practices are deeply intertwined, the former kind of may fade away, and what remains is just the underlying institutional structure and the sedimented behavior patterns. Okay, so one people might even not be aware of the ideological origin of their attitudes, dispositions, and habits because they are taken for granted. They just pass down over generations. So colonial legacies may live on in these embodied habits that develop through a history of encounters and cycles. So that would be the first topic, and then we can move on to the next one. It's something totally unrelated. So it's the kind of a psychological approach to collective forgetting. So remember the first slide I was talking about this bottom up approaches to collective memory formation. So how individual memories change and come to be shared within dyads and small groups. So obviously psychologists did not start with that, but they focused on individual memory. Okay, and one of the key findings that made them to turn towards collective memory was was something termed retrieval-induced forgetting. So it's they find that people are more likely to forget unmentioned content of a previously studied material related to those mentioned during the experiment than unmentioned, unrelated content. Okay, I know it's really confusing. So what does that mean? So what they usually did, it's like a laboratory experiment. So they ask a participant to memorize a set of word pairs. Okay, so they sit down and they're just reading these things like fruit, orange, fruit, banana, drink, whiskey, drink, bourbon. And then for 10 minutes, they do something else just to distract them. Okay, and there is a retrieval practice. So what they do, they practice just, some words from some pairs, but not others. So they just, for example, practice orange, but not banana, and they don't practice some other unrelated kind of word pairs at all. So they wouldn't, for example, practice whiskey and bourbon. But what is really interesting, what happened, so they again do something for 10 minutes for something else, and when they ask the folks, okay, so now remember all food and all drinks, what you can remember. So they would more likely remember whiskey and bourbon than banana. Okay, so obviously they would remember orange because they practiced that. But what relates banana, they wouldn't. They would rather remember that was also unmentioned but unrelated whiskey and bourbon. So the idea here is that the forgotten material, okay, like banana, it becomes during praxis becomes temporarily inaccessible to avoid semantic category interference with the target material, which in this case would be the orange, to be recalled. And they say that at the final practice, when they ask them to remember everything, this kind of inhibition lingers. But this is just a theory, so they don't really know what's happening. So this inhibition is just an idea. It's the most accepted view, but it's still, again, something we don't know why it's happening. So put it another way, what happens is that the repeated recall of certain memories, coupled with silencing other contextually or semantically relevant ones, may subsequently result in no access to the latter to facilitate remembering the former. Okay, so this is the key idea. But what happened, then obviously people started, uh, psychologists was interested whether it happens between people, not just, asking individuals to learn, but what happens if people are listening to each other. And they found this is happening also in conversation. So they found that people may actually forget details of previously learned material and even personal memories if they listen to people selectively recounting it, even their own personal memories. Okay, and another study confirmed that they not only people may, so that means that people may forget certain information by selectively recounting a story together, which they both previously read, but also their accounts significantly converge, meaning that they remember and forget almost the same material. So this is kind of obviously give them a clue that it's something might relate to collective memory formation. Okay, they find also like, and that's a central speaker induced forgetting in a group of four, and the memory convergence at the collective level is amplified if group members had the opportunity to discuss what they heard. It's really interesting. Oh, hang on, what's happening? Oh, it's animated. Right. So, and this is the important part. So they found that this forgetting effect, the social shared retrieval-induced forgetting, uh, is more robust if the conversation partners, interaction partners, perceive each other as belonging to the same social group. Okay, so the most and it's been confirmed in many studies that one of the most recent when they actually tested it in out in the wild, so in like a real world settings that were like French-speaking members of the audience at the Belgian King's public speech remember fewer facts related to topics mentioned by the king following the speech than what they listed prior to it. So obviously what happened, they anticipated the researchers that the king's going to have a speech and then recruited people and asked them about topics that they assumed that the king is going to talk about, some politically relevant topic, which eventually he did. And these people, so they listed certain, facts or memories, and later after the speech, they asked them again, and they couldn't list everything. And it's really, and it's interesting, it's important that the French, because it didn't happen with Dutch speakers, okay? So their memory proved to be more accurate. And this is what the argument, so the researchers argue is probably because the latter are less likely to identify with the monarchy, okay? Um, Now, the idea here is because it's obviously, I mean, you can see that what was the reason behind the retrieval-induced forgetting in terms of individual memory, this kind of semantic category interference and inhibition, it wouldn't, explain what's happening here when they perceive each other like as sharing a social group. So the hypothesis here is like that listeners concurrently or covertly retrieve with the speaker to enhance social bonding and also if they share the identity that kind of reinforce in-group ties. But again, we don't know what's happening here, so how they do that. Okay. What is really important also that the sensitivity of the information in terms of whether it poses a threat to the identity of the group, it matters. Okay, so it's some kind of embarrassing or incriminating information. So they did an experiment. So American participants were asked to read some fictitious atrocities committed by American and some by Afghan soldiers in Afghanistan, and also the justifications for these atrocities. And then they were asked to listen to speakers selectively remember some stories, but without justifications So what happened? So in the final memory test, they were asked to remember all they could from the stories. And as you can guess, so this forgetting only occurred regarding justifications for atrocities committed by the Afghans, but not the Americans. Okay, so they say that this is what it means that if identity is at stake, they would remember. Okay, and it's also a question that would this result kind of imply that people were more likely to forget facts about an event that undermine, the self-esteem of the group they belong to when listening to a speaker selectively remembering the event while being silent of these facts. I mean, possibly or most likely, yeah, this is what happening. Now, why is it interesting for historical criminology and memory? Hang on, activism. Now, so memory activism is again is become a really important and growing subfield within memory studies, and they aim at to change mainstream uh, practices, memory practices, and hegemonic narratives about historical injustice by raising public awareness about this multidirectional nature of collective memory and highlight marginalized voices. Okay, so this is something that also, I mean, the purpose that they share with historical criminology. So one of the important ideas here is faithfulness to the past. Okay, so it's not just like an epistemic responsibility according to Campbell, but also a moral responsibility. So the idea is that it requires members of the group to kind of refocus and recontextualize memories of historical events in a way that it incorporates and take into account the perspective of others and the significance these events have for these people. Okay, and it's interesting. I mean, just incidentally, in support of her point, Campbell draws on the example of Madres de Plaza de Mayo. So it's the Argentinian case. So it marched in the plaza for years wearing the photo IDs of their children who got lost during the dictatorship, the military dictatorship. And this is an example exactly what Churchill and colleagues also cite to emphasize their own purpose to confront these dominant narratives. Okay, so but what can we learn from psychological insights that so what we remember and forget is highly situation specific and dynamically changes in social interactions. So it's really influenced by who we are interacting with and how we identify with these people. So it's really the problem, not that these people should be, or people should be in general educated about, okay, what happened or the ugly sides of, the national past, because they simply, even if they know that they simply struggle to, they literally struggle to access this information when their social identity is at stake. And this is a kind of, just to give you an example, I argued elsewhere that something similar happens with respect to the Hungarians who support Russia in their invasion against the Ukraine while commemorating the 1956 revolution. Because apparently they, without thinking of who crashed those revolutions, the Soviets, right? So, there is nothing ugly in this collective memory incriminating. In fact, on the contrary, it's kind of this revolution. It's always been a symbol of Hungarian national unity and freedom and independence. Okay, but it doesn't matter because in this case they're in conflict with their identity. Okay, their pro-Russian stance. Now, um, what's the time? I got 15 minutes, so well, that's good. So the last is going to take us to the third topic, which is the relationship between past, present, and future. Okay, so because of the ultimate aim of historical criminology is to somehow facilitate, obviously, like progressive social change. It's not, only interested how the past bears on the present, but also how societies relate to their future. Okay, but there is more to this problem than simply acknowledging that our plans and intentions guide our actions in the present. Now, to highlight the interrelatedness of past, present, and future, Church and colleagues draw from Kosalak notions of space of experiences, and horizons of expectations. So these two categories explain that how past experiences inform present actions and future plans, and how our plans kind of orient us in the present. Okay, so Proxalak famously said that no expectations without experience, no experience without expectations. Okay, so following Proxalak, Church and colleagues is kind of predominantly focus on past present, past future, and future present relationships. And what is somewhat kind of neglected is how the future influences the past. But it's a perfectly valid question that can imagining the future influence how we remember the past? Okay, and this is what it is a really fast developing line of research in memory studies that addresses not just that issue, but so many other interesting, fascinating issues that kind of relates to the relationship between imagining and remembering. Okay, so the key argument here is that our desires and concerns about the future are intimately linked to remembering in the past and remembering the past and vice versa. So memories change in light of our fantasies just as much as fantasies feed on memories. Uh, Now, so what is the relationship between remembering and imagining? So this is kind of a key consideration in this research, that the process of imagination and remembering is highly intertwined. And this idea goes back to Frederick Bartlett, one of the founding fathers of cognitive and experimental psychology. So he did lots of experiments, and he found that remembering is seldom accurate, but rather akin to an imaginative reconstruction and heavily influenced by the motives and interests and attitudes of the people at the time of the recall. Okay, so it follows the schematic patterns such that memories are constructed from some various similar and relevant past experiences, not just the one that we're trying to remember. Okay, so in other words, they are kind of we're mixing up. And remember, we're mixing up different pasts. So we also remember what could have happened, not just what really happened. And based on this observation, Bartlett argued that the function of memory is not accurately reproduce the past, but rather to help us adjust our actions and predict situations to adapt our environment and achieve our goals. This idea is perhaps kind of less obvious regarding episodic memory than procedural memory, not that this taxonomy existed at the time. Okay, but I mean, contemporary neuropsychological research actually confirmed that episodic remembering and imagining are in fact kind of supported by the same brain regions. And it's now a really popular view that they're two kind of part of a single neurocognitive system with the main function of episodic simulation and episodic future thinking. So this would be our ability to imagine possible future events and simulate what could happen in future scenarios. Okay, uh, I think this is my last slide. So we're almost there. Okay, so research had kind of long focused on only on the structure of personal future thinking, so how individuals think about their own future. And Spooner, I don't know how to pronounce their name, they proposed that memory studies should move beyond it and pay attention to how people, whether individually or collectively, think about the future of the group they belong to. And they coined this term, defined collective future thought as the act of imagining an event that has yet to transpire on behalf of or by a group. It's really important because it matters if people think about the future on their own or as a group. But I'm not going to talk about this today. Um, Also, this phenomenon, also this collective future thought, also known as collective mental time travel. You can find this in the literature. Anyway, so according to them, the Spooner collective memory changing in the present, influenced by current interest and of the group, as has been demonstrated by many studies since Holbach's, is only just partly explain why memories change. So they say that the way in which group imagines its future also alter how it remembers the past. Okay. Now, why is that? So they essentially point out that the function of both collective remembering and collective future thought bears on the preservation or the temporal continuity of the group as such. So it's like collective identity, just like personal identity, is never fixed. And if the group's imagined self-image or prospects, for survival come into tension with how the past has been remembered or how it informed our everyday lives, these adjustments are inevitable. And they bring the example of how our view, for example, on the invention of the combustion engines, cars, yeah, has been changing from great technical innovation to a serious mistake in light of the future we project because of climate change. But you can also kind of think of how the memory of once kind of respected and celebrated figures like Francis Galton or Edward Colston has changed with the vision of a more just and inclusive society. Colston, you don't need to interact. Colston from Bristol, the slave trader, and Galton is the founding father of eugenics. I mean, the EU just started. I mean, they just removed. I think it was 2007 that they removed his names. Before that, it was fine. Uh, but it's also important that this kind of reconstruction of memories by changing their valence can, of course, kind of occur in an opposite direction. And they bring the example of the infamous Bush and Gore 2000 Supreme Court decision. Just how this kind of memory of this decision is transferred in the political crisis following the failed 2021 insurrection in the States. So what happened there is, if you don't remember, so during the 2000 election, the Florida court has ordered to recount of the votes, and the Bush campaign team approached the Supreme Court to hold this recount, which it did. Okay, so it's been considered until now. It's been considered as a stain of US institutional exceptionalism, and it suddenly become a symbol to save it. Okay, after what Trump did, with the focus shifting from the Supreme Court decision itself to the figure of Gore and as a national hero or as a patriot. It's really interesting. Um, okay, right. So one of the key themes in collective future thought research has focused on its valence. So it means that whether people think negatively or positively about the group's future and how it compares to the way in which they remember the collective past. So people often reminisce about their own past and are typically also positive when plan, the future, like moving to a new house or getting a new job. Okay, but these trajectories are different when they think about the national past and the future. So while participants were more optimistic about the shared future than the past in many studies, the overwhelming finding display the opposite patterns. Okay, especially in Western countries. So people tend to be positively biased towards the collective past. For example, in the US, they forget about the slavery or the Native American genocide and imagine negative events for the future. And the argument here is that it happens because in countries like the States, where these declinist narratives dominate political discourse, people are likely to internalize these templates as cognitive schemas, which may account for these biases in collective memory and future thought. Okay, so they also find similar patterns in France, that the higher the participants kind of rated the level of anomie in the Durkheimian sense in society, the more pessimistic they were about the future. Um, yeah, and these findings actually kind of resonate well with Church and colleagues' discussion on many people having a sense of lost and stolen future in the shadow of like environmental catastrophes or mass violence and political crisis. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and there's no conclusion. I would just say that kind of memory studies, it's a very resourceful field, I think, that would facilitate historical criminological research. So I really encourage everyone to dive into this, okay, because it's huge relevant, I think. Thank you. And I put some references here. You might use. It's not all, but it might be useful. Okay, that's me. I'm going to stop sharing. What do you think, Asmarie? Or
No, thank you very much. Can I ask, can you share your slides with us so I can forward to the group?
sorry,
Yes.
yeah, sorry if I can.
Can you share your slides with us so I can forward to the group?
Yeah, of course.
Would
Yeah,
that be okay? Okay.
yeah,
If just even if just your references.
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
the idea.
Thank you very much for that. I find this very, very fascinating. I was scribbling notes here, thinking of how the lens and logics of memory or memory studies can sort of help organize the looser ideas that I've been working with that don't seem to have a form or structure at this time. Guys, I would say I'll encourage you to write your questions in the chat or raise your hand. So far in the past, both have worked really well. I I sort of kicked off. I see there is either. Okay, yes. Leah says definitely she would love to access your references, Daniel.
Yeah,
Um,
certainly. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can send you the slides and all, and yeah, and then you can share. Or people, you can email me, and I can send you.
okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you very much. So I kicked off. I have a couple of questions, but I wanted to start with just one and give the others the floor to ask their
should.
own questions. So initially, I asked a very blunt-edged question. I asked why should we care, or as criminologists or historical criminologists care about the lens of memory studies. But then you went further and you discussed criminological thinking, Churchill, Canning, and a number of others. So I went on to ask instead something about historical time, but then I had a sort of more specific question because something came has kept cropping up in conversation, especially around professional choices. And so I'll stick with historical time for now, and then I'll move on to that later on. So, in terms of historical time and collective memory, can you comment on why criminologists just would speak to the importance of this intersection for communities, for especially if for communities who are attempting to imagine a more positive future?
Okay, so if I if I understand the question correct, so the first question was that why we should as criminologists care about memory studies as such, or why should we care about research on future thought? Or can you please
So it
clarify?
so it's two connected but distinct questions. So the first is why we should care about the lens of memory studies. How can that contribute
Okay.
to our existing I would say
Yeah.
interdisciplinarity. And the other part, the other distinct section has to do with historical time and it's more future proofing. So
Yeah, yeah, okay. So now I got you. So the first one is the collective memory, because I mean, collective memory is such an important concept for historical criminology, right? So even in the book, they discuss a whole chapter. But even without this, I mean, how the past impact on our present, it's to research that you can't avoid collective memory. And memory studies, especially focusing on that. And I was kind of quite surprised when reading the book and even kind of literature. And that's why I apologize if I missed something. And in fact, can you please let me know if there is, researchers like working on collective, criminologists working on or engaging with collective memory research. Because, I mean, these questions that we address here in history criminology have been extensively discussed in memory studies. So I think we would just benefit from using this literature rather than go back to like Holbach's and Osman. And it's not saying they're not important. And in fact, for example, Holbach's, there is a new translation apparently is coming out. I had a chat with the editor next year because the English translation of the first book is apparently it's not really good, and that it's full of flaws, and that's why future generations of researchers kind of almost totally misunderstood Hallmark. So I'm not saying that new kind of readings are welcome, but there is a booming research and collective memory. So I think historical communities should really engage and learn from memory scholars. Okay, and as to future thinking, I mean, this is the thing that it's really important. For example, that to know our I mean, policymakers for a reform to succeed, how people again relate to their future, what they think about what's going to happen, whether they're pessimistic about or not, because this is how, I mean, we kind of steering these sort of emotions and attitudes or possibly change. We need to know what's happening, what kind of, psychological processing underlie these sort of attitudes. Okay, so I think it's also something really important. And this research started on collective future thought. It's in 2016. But I mean, Churchill and colleagues, they kind of put a heavy emphasis on that. So I don't need to defend, I think, the focus on future thinking and how people imagine their past. I think it's really important, and it's really not obvious, and it's like totally different. I mean, as I kind of touched upon that how people they think about their individual futures, and it's even kind of diversity between different nations. So I think it's it's really interesting to know in terms of planning, as in terms of planning policy, right?
Mm.
Is that an answer?
Yeah, no, that's it. That's interesting. I'm also thinking a little bit about lenience and justice. So whether we're thinking about the way that justice, if we think about just justice and lenience as interactive or intersecting resources, in the context in my context of youth justice, and how we see how both can be undermined or enabled by what appears to be a sort of collective and I know within the judiciary, historical and collective matter very much because of the idea of precedence, for instance, right? But there seems to be in question some questions that I'm working through has to do with why there seems to be such a that in judicial performativity, why there seems to be such a resort to memory, to these precedents, this role playing of labeling certain groups of people as ones for whom lenience is necessary and others for whom lenience is denied. And so I'm thinking of lenience of this collectivity and this performativity in these contexts where it seems to matter very much that history matters. And so at what point do we do in these contexts, do these judges switch their performance and say, all right, we now need to look at these groups of young people in a different way for the future? Because we know, for instance, in the UK, when you convict a young person, they have a criminal label that they carry with them for the rest of their lives. It's impossible for them to overcome it. But there seems to be a tendency to use the judiciary as a to say it's weaponized is wouldn't be inappropriate. So there's a sense that there's this historical baggage that these young people have to bear because the judiciary really relies, they seem to perform on this, sorry, they rely on this collective performance that's based in history. So it,
Also, okay, so you talk about so like the path dependence of like judicial practices and so on, yeah?
yeah. So
Yeah. Okay,
there's
but
a,
how does that relate to future thinking? Sorry, I'm not sure if I
well,
followed.
for future thinking, right? So we're thinking about young people, and we know that sentences are given time. So you're given a 5-year sentence, but for a young person in the UK, that sentence is a life sentence
Uh-huh.
because you have to declare your criminal record when you get a job. So any kind of normative performance is undermined for the future.
Oh, okay. So okay, so I mean the children's future.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and for society's future.
Yeah, okay, but it's something okay, I got it. But it's something to do with obviously to change this kind of pad the pants and or the practice of the judges, and then yes, see the root causes. But I think why um I'll give you an example why I think future obviously obviously it kind of implicitly it relates to the children's future because then you would obviously change if they change the practices then they might change the future. But it's not much to do, I mean, how they or it would be interesting to know how they see their future. I mean, children. But I was, for example, thinking about like climate justice, right? So if to know why what people think about, the future, how it's going to change, and know the reason why they think either pessimistically or optimistically, it would be kind of you could change that so that we be more proactive, to be more ready to do about something. Okay. Yeah, so this is why I think it's important. So what you're talking about is probably obviously there are so many things there's in kind of intersect in this issue. So like wrong and negative practice, so and then but it's a different question how we should kind of deal with this. Um,
Yeah, but this also there's another question in the chat by Kira. Just very briefly, this also impacts on how certain demographics of young people see themselves, even before they enter into a court system or a judicial process, because they have adapted or adopted this identity because it's been deployed. And this is also sort of these negative histories and which are sort of reproduced and they inherit. So if we think of justice in general, so climate justice, people thinking pessimistically, I think about, for instance, the Caribbean and the growth of hurricanes. And I think each year there's a new hurricane. And so why should people even bother rebuilding their homes, et cetera? But the same thing goes for justice in general. So criminal justice, young people growing up in certain contexts are saddled with offender identities, whether or not they have actually performed as offenders. They're attributed, they're surveilled as such. But okay, so I'll move to Kira's question. But
okay.
I think you've given me something to work with is essentially what I'm saying. So this lens is worth sort of pursuing in terms of how to structure what I'm trying to say. Kira, did you want to read your question?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Rosemary. And thanks a million, Daniel, for such an interesting presentation as well. Nice to see you.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry if my question's a bit unfair because I know this wasn't the main focus of your presentation, but you'd mentioned with that third wave of memory studies that there's more focus now on the role of technological innovation and how that's shaping collective memory. And I was wondering, could you speak more to that? I was reading more stuff about kind of Anthony Giddens and this kind of how the rise of social media is facilitating us telling more stories about ourselves and portraying ourselves as this kind of self-improvement project. And I was wondering if that kind of approach feeds into collective memory. And maybe also for historical criminologists, is there more scope that we explore these more contemporary forms of how collective memory is being shaped and then how that kind of maybe differs from the past as well? I'd just be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I must disappoint you about the first question because the media. So yeah, so there's a lot on that, like how the internet usage and media shape the range people remember. But I'm kind of not really focusing. My research is not focusing on that. Um, but there is actually a journal, and I will send this to you. It's been established 2, 3 years ago. It's I think memory, media, and I don't know, culture or something at Glasgow Uni, and they're especially focusing on these things. But I will email you this because they obviously probably there you will find lots of resources. So my research focusing on the relationship with identification and memory. So how kind of identities change and how these changes of identity kind of changes in memory. Sorry, what was the second
No,
question?
absolutely. It was more so, I suppose, can historical criminology, is there scope for us to engage more in how technological change is facilitating or shaping collective memory now compared to the past? But I fully appreciate that this is not the main area that
Yeah,
you're
no,
focusing on. Sorry, I went off a bit of a tangent there.
yeah. But actually there's a massive kind of body of research on that. And I mean I can't talk about it, but I can help you to find the resource.
That would be brilliant. Thanks, Mil Daniel.
Cheers.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions for Daniel?
No?
Okay. Um, it was you've given us a lot to think about in terms of
No,
memory studies.
yeah, but I understand it was quite of a lot, so that's why I'm sorry about that. So we're talking about a lot of things and kind of also interrelated issues. So
No, I mean, I would say that in taking this in, sharing your research with us is a good starting point for continued discussion. So I think what we have to work with is also necessarily starts with how we formulate the questions that we need to ask. So I think there's another one by Leah, from Leah. Leah, did you want to ask?
Why is it not? Hi. Oh, this was very interesting. So thank you very much. It's quite a lot to think about. So I think I need to just read it over again, to
yeah,
get
of
some of
course.
it. Um, I guess the question that I would have, because because currently we're working on a project here at NTU around the closures of courts, magistrate courts in England and Wales. And one of the questions that we were talking about was this idea around, or playing with the idea around myself, essentially around collective memory and how people interact with the justice system and with the closure of these magistrate courts. What is that collective memory in sense of these communities as it relates to their relationship with the state? Because these courts represent that really significant relationship between the community and the state. Probably might be the only representation there besides the police. So now
Hmm.
you've just taken that out of the community, and I think we're trying to. I was trying to figure out how do I engage with this idea of collective memory and the relationship with the justice system. And what does that mean for other austerity measures that may be coming in various communities that are deprived of justice or individuals who think that, they have this, they don't have really in real connection with the state. So it's not necessarily a question, but uh, it's just that you've given me quite a lot to think about when it comes to putting those bits and pieces together. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. So just okay. So if I got it right, there was a court and they shut
They're
this
doing,
down.
they have, since 2010, they've been closing courts, magistrate courts across England and Wales.
Uh-huh. Okay, no, because it's really interesting because it relates actually to the question of the relationship between like memory in the head and memory in the word, because the court could be seen as some sort of like a cultural resource of collective memory, how people relate to the whole justice system. And it's really interesting because maybe, but I would suggest, I mean, I would ask them too that, okay, so what do you think about it? Because there are so many times there is kind of assumptions in terms of, I mean, I don't know if it's in your case it would be true or not, but for example, in the Hungarian case, that we assume that people, a community, as a collective, that actually have some sort of, you know, um, these buildings or these artifacts, some sort of significance on this community as a whole, but maybe not. Maybe it's totally kind of diverse and plural, and depending on the people and depending on again their identities. So it would be really interesting to see that how they see this. Okay, because I think you would find lots of different opinions. Maybe yeah, for some it was actually really important, maybe, but less for others. Okay, and this is what I see like in my context, in the Hungarian context, for example, regarding these revolutions, okay, the Hungarian revolutions. So, I mean, collective memory is really not always that collective. This is what my point is. Yeah. So we need to kind of challenge these assumptions.
Yeah, I absolutely get that. I think the other, I don't know if I haven't formulated the question properly in my head, but I'm gonna spit it out. Even in thinking about historical crime, for example, doing research around colonialism and looking at archival resources,
Mm.
I'm wondering how can this like use the use of archives like records and letters, how can this provide an understanding of, as you said, the retrieval of things that we've probably forgotten and identity, and how would we connect those things methodology in a methodology kind of way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
And
I think,
I haven't formulated the question properly in my mind.
but I think I understand. I mean, I think this archival research is really important, especially because it's like collective memories, and let that be like embodied habits, like, or any habits. They're like words too. They got like an etymological origin, but we don't know. We use words, but we don't know where they come from. And sometimes it's when you kind of dig down, you find some really funny stories where okay, and that's the thing. Archival research would be really important because maybe you can find the long forgotten origin of certain practices in the criminal justice. And then you can, from then on, you can follow up what actually happened and how it developed to its current state. So I think I'm not against archival research. I think it's really important, but you need to look at these things in their continuity. And we can't really forget about the present.
That's
Thank you.
that's really
Thank
interesting.
you.
Can you comment? You mentioned the Hungarian example, and I thought that was really interesting because I grew up in a study diet of Cold War history and politics, and so it's kind of interesting seeing a sort of reproduction of these things, especially with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, trying to regain the sort of Soviet dominance and hegemony. Now, can you comment on on the the Hungarian component, the contemporary Hungarian component, which you mentioned just now? Um,
Oh, retrospect, that is kind of changes. And okay, so what I'm interested in the Hungarian context is how um, kind of people with different political affiliation and age relate to the memory of the revolution. Because I think it's just this assumption that it's something really important for the whole nation, like something really like symbolizes the national unity. I think it's kind of outdated. This is what I'm hoping to find that it's that we'll probably see very discrepancies in the age group within age groups and political groups. It doesn't really matter like whether you actually witness those events, you have lots of people still living or you learn about it. No, I think it's even I will find some people in each age group that they relate to these things totally differently. I mean, I give you another example. Maybe you heard that from me because I that's my favorite example in the Hungarian context. The when we had in 2015, and also it's an example for how it's like situation specific collective memories. So how like in 2015 there was the immigration or the refugee crisis, not immigration, the refugee crisis, and Orban in Hungary used the memory of the Ottoman occupation to scare these people. I mean, the Hungarians were that, oh, we don't need that because they're going to come in and, it's going to rape our women and they will be crime. Okay. So, and people, everyone was like totally, fat for this. And then the same year, they used again, Erdogan, president of Turkey, was in Hungary and they had both a speech, Orban and him, at a monument. They just, renovated some Islamic pilgrimage site, and then they were both talking about it, how nice at the time was during the Ottoman occupation. We lived in a symbiosis, and we learned, each other kind of, words, language, and then the people were like the same audience were like there, like, and everyone was like, again, uh, totally like, fair for this. So there's the same political group in on the one hand kind of remember the collective memory of the Ottoman occupation as something horrifying,
yeah.
and in another situation, again, who you kind of talk to, who is your interaction partner, well, they were totally kind of reminiscing about it. So I think it's,
Romanticizing, yeah.
yeah.
So do you think whether it's better or for worse that the sort of nostalgia, that ability to touch history, is used as it's used as it shapes identity and it has shaped the identity so much that it's a reference point for better or for worse.
But that's the thing that is kind of, the door swings both ways. So it's also identity shapes, what you remember. And that's the thing that because we all have different identities, and then these identities, different identities triggered in different situation, and you remember things accordingly. totally differently. So that's the thing, that collective memory is not like kind of fixed. It even
Yeah.
fluctuates, even with respect to individuals, not just generations, groups, nations. Even one single person have not one single collective memory uh, about one specific event. It really depends on who you kind of remembering together.
who's 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 your memory participant, so your memory companion, like your
Yeah.
yeah, it's because so it's quite interactive. I'll reiterate a point I made earlier. I have never really necessarily organized my thinking or my ideas through the lens of this logic, but in listening to your presentation, I would honestly say that you've given me a lot to work with. I'm currently working on some archival projects, and obviously both Kira and Leah also similarly are interested or intrigued by this lens, and everyone here obviously has come because they're interested in hearing this. So thank you very much for this, Daniel. I hope to speak more about this with you and others who are interested in this. And if you could, I will actually at the end of this, we'll send you an email to say thank you, but also to ask for besides and look forward to the participants here today. And if we could give Daniel a round of applause. Um,
Thank you, guys.
find the button myself.
And thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. I'm glad I finally got to hear your talk again. And well, have a wonderful rest of the evening. We can all now relax and go on to do some marking. Um, guys, thank you so much for coming. Daniel, could you hang back for five
Thank
more
you.
minutes?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
It's us.
Let me stop the recording.
Well, I can also stop sharing this, right? I could have done that before.